Labour housing. Oh, so just to let everybody know, we're going to be recording this event. Is that okay? Could you express? I'm seeing some thumbs up, so that's good. So welcome. This is the Labour Housing Group Fringe meeting at the Labour Women's Conference event. It's fantastic. So the Labour Women's Conference doesn't start until this weekend, and it's fantastic that there's been so much interest in Fringe events that they've expanded into this week as well. So really pleased to see you all here and grateful that we've been able to create this time. So my name is Rachel Blake. I'm a councillor in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, where I'm also Deputy Mayor and lead member for Adults, Health and Wellbeing, and I'm a member of the Labour Housing Group Exec. And we've put together a really exciting and experienced panel for you today to talk about how the housing crisis is disproportionately affecting women and disproportionately affecting women from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. It's something that we are particularly passionate about in the Labour Housing Group, and we're now really focusing on a campaign around a rights-based approach to housing. So this is part of our overall work. So today I'm just going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves first. We are still waiting for Safia Jama to arrive because she's speaking at her own conference. So I will ask Denise and Nicki to introduce themselves and then share with us their presentations and opening remarks, and then open it out to questions and discussion. So over to you, Denise.
Hi, so I'm Denise Fowler and I'm Chief Executive of Women's Pioneer Housing, which is a small women's housing association in West London with about 1,000 properties. Before coming here, I used to be the Housing Ombudsman for England, and before that I was the Director of Legal Services for what is now MHCLG. So I've got a long history in housing. I'm also, since joining Women's Pioneer, set up something called the Women's Housing Forum, which is a national network which aims to raise awareness of the links between women's housing needs and gender inequality, and to encourage social housing providers and other strategic partners, including local authorities, to work together to tackle these issues.
Thanks, Denise. Nicki?
Good morning. I'm Nicki Spear. I'm the Customer Enabling Manager and Domestic Abuse Lead at Westwood Housing Group. We're based in Devon and Cornwall, across the two counties. I also chair the Southwest Domestic Abuse Forum, which is made up of housing providers, local authorities and domestic abuse support services. And we cover from Gloucester down to Penzance. And I'm also a survivor of abuse.
Thank you, Nicki. Can I invite you, Denise, now to make your opening remarks?
Oh, hi, I thought Nicki was going first.
Oh, okay, Nicki.
I don't mind. Okay. Okay then. So as the topic today is about women's access to housing, I'm going to be focusing on women as the victims of domestic abuse, but I just wanted to point out that many issues will also apply to male victims. It is important, I think, to note, however, that domestic abuse is very much a gendered crime, and around 75% of all victims are women. Women are also disproportionately much more likely to be killed by a partner or an ex-partner, and in 2018 there were 270 women killed by a partner or ex-partner compared to 43 men. So it is very gendered, and those numbers are very consistent year on year. Domestic abuse victims suffer a range of issues when they access housing. Firstly, economic abuse often affects their ability to access resources, which includes housing. Secondly, there's a significant shortage of refuge space and move-on accommodation. There's also a shortage, as we know, of safe, secure and affordable homes. And there are punitive local connection criteria in some parts of the country which prevent victims from accessing housing. Any woman who suffers domestic abuse is likely to suffer financial or economic abuse as part of that. And all domestic abuse, no matter what form it takes, is about the perpetrator having power and control over the victim. And there's no better way of achieving that than by controlling their access to money and resources. And that doesn't always happen just in the relationship. It can continue long after that relationship has ended. And perpetrators will do things like withholding child maintenance payments or claim they have no income to pay those payments. And for someone already on a very low income, that could mean significant hardship, and many will have to use food banks and get into debt in order to provide those basics for the family. The result of that abuse is that victims will often have a history of arrears on their rent or their mortgage account, as well as other debts in place. And whether they decide to remain in that home or they are forced to seek accommodation elsewhere, that will act as a barrier to them moving forward with regard to housing. For victims who are able to stay in their homes, that means that very often they have a choice of setting up a payment plan to clear the arrears or potentially facing eviction and all the things that come with that. The perpetrator will almost invariably not contribute to the arrears in any way once they've left, so it's down to that victim solely to deal with that. And when they're already on a very low income, that's a daunting situation, and some victims will decide to stay in that abusive relationship. For victims who are forced to flee, finding alternative accommodation can be a challenge, and that doesn't matter whether it's refuge space, safe houses, or permanent accommodation. There was a recent Women's Aid report which found that 64% of all refuge referrals are declined. And some of the reasons around that they found were that the number of bed spaces in England were 30% below that was recommended. And more than 1 in 5 of the refuge services in England had no local authority commissioned funding. Almost 20% of bed spaces, refuge bed spaces, weren't being funded through local authority commissioning. And for the BAME community, there was just 18 refuge services that were run by and for those communities. And over half of those spaces were funded by non-commissioned services, so not by that local authority. And of the services that were commissioned, over 80% said they didn't receive enough funding to support all of their support staff costs. And all of that feeds into why women are turned away from refuge. To put it into context, I'll give an example from where I live, which is in Devon. And in Devon, we currently have just 1 charity-funded refuge with 25 bed spaces and 3 safe houses for a population of around 1.2 million people. That's clearly woefully inadequate, and victims are often forced to move far away to access safe housing. With the pandemic having made that situation worse and ever more victims coming forward, that's a situation which must be addressed urgently if we're to save women's lives. When women are ready to leave refuge and move to more permanent accommodation, unfortunately, the situation often doesn't improve. And due to low incomes and often part-time or 0 hours employment, it can be hard for victims to access mortgages and private rented properties, so social housing is often the only option. Now, we're all massively aware that there's a massive shortage in affordable housing, but one thing that's rarely discussed is the need for affordable women-only accommodation, where victims can feel safe and recover from the trauma of the abuse. And with many victims suffering from mental health issues like PTSD when they leave the abuse, having women-only accommodation as an option to recover in is just essential. And likewise, many BAME victims prefer this type of accommodation. There is some provision for this across the country, and I'm sure Denise will talk about this further in a moment, but it is in short supply and it doesn't exist in many areas. And there's a need for local authorities to provide this type of accommodation for victims as part of their housing offer for women escaping abuse. Now, in some areas of the country, housing faces other challenges, including the area that I live in, which has a high rate of second home ownership. And because of that, local authorities are very keen, understandably, to ensure that local people are given priority for any affordable housing in the local areas. Because of that, there's a high prevalence of not just local connection criteria applied to properties in the area, but also Section 106 agreements, which prohibit allocation of properties to anyone who cannot demonstrate the required links to the local areas. So for a domestic abuse victim who's had to move home to escape their abuser, it's often impossible for them to meet that criteria. And although the statutory guidance states that those who need to move between local authority districts in order to escape domestic abuse are not disadvantaged by a residency or local connection test, that unfortunately is not the case in many areas. And victims fleeing abuse or leaving refuge are often classed as medium housing need rather than high. That leads to the victim either being unable to leave refuge and therefore preventing a space coming available for another victim, or going into temporary accommodation. It's also worth noting that that's also an issue for the homeless, who are often also unable to prove that required link to the area. And the properties are often let to applicants banded as no housing need, rather than the domestic abuse victim or the homeless person. And that's just heartbreaking as a housing provider to be in that situation. I'll give you an example of a case that I dealt with before I wrap up. A case I dealt with was a lady and her 3 children, and they'd fled to a refuge in their local area in another part of the country before moving to a refuge in the southwest. And they'd moved to another refuge because the perpetrator found her. After they'd been in that refuge for the maximum 12-week period, she was moved to temporary accommodation because permanent accommodation couldn't be found. She registered through the local home choice system and was given a Band C banding, which is medium housing need. And despite appealing that, the Band C was upheld, and the request for a Band B, which is high housing need, was rejected. Over the next 8 months, the family moved multiple times, living mainly in caravan parks used for temporary accommodation. And during that time, the family experienced frequent antisocial behaviour incidents in the vicinity of their accommodation, and the police regularly attended to neighbouring properties. The situation led to the victim and her children feeling extremely vulnerable and re-traumatised by the whole experience. Despite that banding, the victim still successfully bid on a number of properties, only to be rejected because she didn't meet that Section 106 criteria for a local connection. The local authority refused to overrule that requirement, and the woman felt completely trapped in the situation, unable to apply elsewhere and unable to afford private rented accommodation. Out of desperation, she eventually contacted a national domestic abuse campaigner about the situation, and they in turn contacted me because she knew I worked in housing. Despite being in lockdown, we offered a direct match to the family, and they were able to move to a permanent home, which has enabled them to start to rebuild their lives and to feel safe for the first time in a very long time. Unfortunately, local home choice systems often restrict the ability of housing providers to offer direct matches to properties for victims, and without that help, they can become trapped in a cycle of not being able to move forward with their life. Because of this, many victims will either become homeless and others will return to the abuser. Now, whilst the Domestic Abuse Act does address some of those issues, it won't resolve all of the hurdles faced by women fleeing abuse. And it's so important that national and local government work together to end the postcode lottery and to ensure that women have the ability to lead their lives safely and are able to provide for those basic needs of their families. No woman should ever have to face a choice of a life of abuse or one of financial hardship. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicki. There's just a question that I think it would be good to hear, just because it's about policy detail. Someone's just asked, what is a direct match?
A direct
housing
match
options
is where we don't go through a local home choice system. So we identify a suitable property for that victim and we just say it's yours. So we don't offer it out to the local home choice system. We just find something that meets that person's needs in the right area and we offer it direct.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thanks, Nicki. Over to you, Denise.
Okay, thanks. Nicki and I have done this before. We've done it in either order, so actually we could have done it in either order. I just thought she was going to go first. But it's really powerful hearing about those individual stories. And what I'm going to do now is just try to give some overall context regarding women and housing in the UK, and to focus on the links between women's housing needs and gender inequality. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Women's Pioneer, including some of our history, and then move to talk on about some of the issues around structural economic inequality for women and the impact that has on women's ability to obtain safe, secure, affordable housing. So the nice bit first. Women's Pioneer Housing was founded by suffragettes in 1920 to help provide housing for the new generation of single women in London following World War I. The new generation of single professional women was the original motivation, but it went on beyond that. the aim was from the beginning that we would house women women of modest means in London who are unable to access housing. We're a small women's housing association with about 1,000 properties in London, but I'd just say that we're the largest women's housing association in the country. So in terms of the housing sector at the moment, there are housing associations with well over 100,000 properties, but 1,000 properties we're the largest for women. Our founder, Ethelred Browning, was a suffragist from Dublin. Other early supporters included the suffragettes Helen Archdale and the suffragists Ray Strachey, who are both on Millicent Fawcett's statue in Parliament Square, Lady Rhonda, Geraldine Lennox, Lenny Carr, a whole load of people. There was amazing women. There was a thriving women's movement at the turn of the 20th century. And for these women, the campaign for the vote was just the first step in a wider campaign for women's rights. Housing was an issue they came together to campaign on. After the First World War, there were a large number of single women trying to make their own way in the world, and housing options were really limited. Lloyd George's government was focused on the needs of men returning from the First World War. So Ethelred and the other founders used their networks to build up a support for a women's housing association. They got people to invest, and they developed homes. They took over houses which were falling out of favour because the upper class couldn't get the servants following the World War I. So they bought these properties, which luckily for us are now in very well-off parts of London, so we can borrow against them to build more housing. Notting Hill, Kensington, Chelsea. And they got one of the first women architects, I think the first one to qualify in the UK, Gertrude Leverkus, to develop these into primarily one beds and studio flats for women. And the association was established on the 4th of October 1920 to cater for the housing requirements of professional and other women of moderate means who require individual homes at moderate rents. And I just want to do a little quote from Ethelred Browning because I think it's relevant today. So she said in the vote in 1921, "The word home generally conveys the idea of a husband as being more or less attached. But because a woman supports herself and stands more or less alone, is this any reason that she must spend her days in a hostel or a bed-sitting room and never arrive at the dignity of a home?" Shockingly, 100 years on, or just over 100 years on, many women still face enormous difficulties in finding a safe, secure, affordable home in the UK. And this is driven by structural inequality, particularly economic inequality. As I'm sure many of you know, the overall hourly gender pay gap is 16.2%. Gender pay widens as women age. It's highest for women aged 50 to 59 at 19.4%. Women from different ethnic groups face different gender pay gaps. Work by the Fawcett Society is the highest, showed that the highest was for Pakistani and Bangladeshi women at 26%. And given the timing, I won't go into lots of the causes. I'm sure you know lots of the things which lead to that gender pay gap. But what isn't often highlighted is that these are hourly figures. And because women are much more likely to work part-time or in the gig economy due to caring responsibilities, the overall earnings gap is much wider. ONS data shows that on average in England, women earn almost 31% less than men do. And the impact builds up over a lifetime. So by retirement age, women are 3 times more likely than men to retire on the state pension alone. And then that overall gender income gap translates into a housing affordability gender gap. Research we did with the National Housing Federation showed that there's no region in England, not a single region in England, where a single woman on an average woman's salary can afford to rent a home of their own in the private rented sector, let alone buy. And by contrast, private rents were affordable on an average man's salary in most regions and were more affordable for men than for women in all regions. On average, women need to spend 41% of their income on rent, whilst men need to spend on average 28% of their incomes. Even in the 3 regions which are most unaffordable for men, the situation is much worse for women. In London, an average rented flat would take up 63% of a woman's average earnings, compared with 49% of a man's average earnings. In the southeast, a rented flat would take up 51% of a woman's average earnings, compared with 33% of a man's average earnings. In the southwest, which is the 3rd least affordable, the area where there's the 3rd greatest gender housing affordability gap, A rented flat would take up 47% of a woman's average earnings compared with 31% of the man's. So the housing affordability gender gap's an issue in every region. And what this means is that many women are financially dependent on their partners. Women's ability to choose to live independently is still, 100 years after Ethelred first campaigned, drastically reduced by structural inequality. It's worth saying as well, there's also potentially an issue about women's housing costs being on average higher than men's. This is an area ripe for more research, but if you consider the issues which women say they value in their homes, safety, security, access to amenities, and accessibility, these are all factors which are likely to push up rents or house prices. So, for example, the Sarah Everard case has highlighted how much more important the length of the journey from the tube or train station to home is to most women and to most men. And those homes are often much more expensive. You know, that location, that accessibility of transport increases prices both to buy and to rent. Social housing makes a huge difference, and it's no surprise given these figures that the majority of social housing tenants are women and that a high proportion of those are Black women. With social housing in such short supply, single women are rarely a priority. I think the Domestic Abuse Act going through may make a significant difference for single women who've experienced domestic abuse, because currently those women are not a priority, but as that comes into force, that hopefully will make a difference. But some of the single women we house at Women's Pioneers say that they've lived their entire adult lives in shared rented housing or lodging in people's homes. It's really common for women in their 50s when a relationship breaks down. It might be irritating to have to argue that about who failed to clean the toilet or drank all the milk in your 20s. If you're doing that in your 50s, it's soul destroying. Often after divorce, men recover their financial situation fairly quickly, I think within, on average, the first 2 years, but women are much less likely to do so. Consequently, 70% of Women's Pioneers tenants are women over 50. And the COVID pandemic has made things worse. So women are overrepresented in many of the sectors which have been hit hardest. Women are more likely to have been furloughed, and we suspect are more likely to have been made redundant. Again, the Forces Society are doing some really fantastic work about this. In one of their surveys, a third of working mothers reported having lost work or hours during the pandemic. And this rose to 44% when it came to Black, Asian and minority ethnic mothers. As you all know, the Women's Equality and Equality Select Committee reported that the government's priorities for recovery are heavily gendered in nature. Investment plans that are skewed towards male-dominated sectors have the potential to create unequal outcomes for men and women, exacerbating existing inequalities. And there hasn't been any recognition really of the importance of expanding social housing at this point, given the importance of housing that's been highlighted during the pandemic. As Nicki has said, women are also much more likely to experience domestic abuse, and homes are a very dangerous place for women, and that has also got significantly worse during this pandemic. A lack of financial independence and the housing affordability gap makes it much harder for women to leave an abusive situation. And as Nicki said, economic abuse is only just starting to be properly recognising. So domestic abuse fits within that overall context of structural inequality. Sometimes people talk about these poor women who've experienced abuse as if it's something that just happened by accident, or it was something about women themselves. But it's absolutely linked within that context of societal inequality and women's financial dependence on men in particular. I'd recommend Sylvia Warby's research. She's a sociologist currently based at City University who's done a lot of work around gender inequality. And she analysed the British crime stats and showed that of those experiencing 10 or more severe criminal incidents of domestic violence, 98% were women and only 2% were men. So although domestic abuse is a gendered crime in terms of who experiences it at its most physically severe and over the longest period is even more strongly gendered. Men are much more likely to have the financial wherewithal to move to a place of greater safety. So I could talk forever about this, but I'll stop and we'll pick up some questions. But I just want to say in conclusion that all women deserve to have a safe, secure, affordable home, and without a safe, secure base, a home of her own, to paraphrase Virginia Woolf, women can't live independent lives. Women's pioneers found us knew this in 1920, and it's every bit as important in 2021.
Thank you, Denise, and for sharing your experiences and some of that really powerful data. I have to say, I find the founding principles of Women's Pioneer very inspiring, but also depressing that the need is still there all those years, decades later. We're still waiting for Safia Jama to join us. She's the Chief Exec of Women's Inclusive Team, a community-based organisation based in Tower Hamlets, which runs a wide range of services supporting women. I've contacted her and she will join us as soon as possible. So can I open it up to questions or reflections going forward? We've got about half an hour for a discussion. So if you can, I can actually, there's enough people that I can just see. So if you raise your hand, or if you don't want to turn your camera on, if you put your hand up, that would be great.
Can I just say that my typing is going wrong? It's Sylvia Walby, W-A-L-B-Y. I'm trying to lean over one thing to type it in, so people want to know the name of the researcher. Sorry. Okay,
Sylvia Walby.
Thank you.
I've got Annie has indicated, and anybody else indicate. I'll take some comments, and then Sheila, Annie, and then Debbie.
Hello. Yes, I'm from Rosendale and Darwin. I'm the Women's Officer for Rosendale. For about a year now, I've been trying to work with our MP, who is Jake Berry, to get his interest in the issues of domestic abuse. Rosendale has no refuge at all. In fact, Rosendale and Darwin has 2 refuges, but we have nothing. We don't even have secure housing. The one thing I wanted to particularly ask, though, is the domestic abuse bill that we were talking about, which of course has still not been enacted. It's made a duty on local authorities to provide secure accommodation for women and children, which actually sounds the way it should be. The trouble is, it's not going to be accompanied by very much funding. So what will happen is, obviously local authorities probably will fail in being able to provide this duty of care, but they're going to fail because there isn't any money or sufficient money in the first place. I was just wondering if anyone had any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Annie. Sheila.
I was trying to find that Sylvia Walby reference. I was just wanting to ask Nicki, a very interesting point you made about PTSD for women who have experienced domestic abuse and what impact that has on their choices or what they would like to choose. What I can imagine that for short-term housing, we do have women only short-term housing. What do you think the implication of that is for longer-term housing? What does that mean we ought to be providing?
I think it's sort of almost.
Nicki, I'm going to have bring in other people, and then we'll come back.
Okay. Oh, right. Sorry.
Debbie.
Hello and thank you. My remark is to Nicki as well.
Debbie.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you now.
Yeah, I think my remark is to Nicki as well, and it's about the local authorities not being able to take on people from outside their area. When I moved 300 miles. I had a good job and no children. It still took me years and years and years to be able to move. How we have to get it really would save lives if the local authorities could take people from outside their area. How can we influence a change to make this happen? Because I think this is really important.
Thanks, Debbie. Those are all really Really strong questions. Is there some feedback, Nicki, on those couple of areas, and then we'll come onto Annie's question about funding. Nicki?
Sorry, do you want me to take those one at a time, or? Sorry.
Yes, about longer term women's housing and what the scope is, but also what we can do to change local authority positions.
Yeah.
Rachel, if it's okay, I'll come in as well around the.
Oh yes, please.
As well. But let Nicki go first, then I'll come in.
Sure. I mean, in terms of Sheila's question around the sort of the PTSD and what the accommodation for that looks like, I think it's almost like a halfway house between the sort of the short-term refuge that in some places we currently have, but as Annie quite rightly said, not in all places at the moment. But that then sort of, some people may want to move into longer term, but I think it should be it's almost a halfway house while people are sort of coming to terms with everything, recovering, and then can make choices about where they want to go and where is the best place for them. So that's how I would sort of see that as looking, really. In terms of the local authorities and moving from outside of areas and how we can influence that, it's something that I think we need to make really clear to local authorities. I think we have to stop the issue of authorities using things like the Section 106 agreements to prevent this, because it does lead to and unfortunately all too often to these ludicrous situations where we've got people in desperate need and the houses are going to people in no housing need. And I'm sure that wasn't the sort of the ethos of how that was meant to work originally. I totally agree with the ethos of local homes for local people in those sort of areas. However, there has to be that need for victims, homeless, whatever it may be. And I think we do need something to say, actually, this cannot apply to these people. And as good as the Domestic Abuse Act is, and it does help a lot, it doesn't actually, I don't see it overcoming that. I've got to be honest. There is nothing specific in it. I think they will still find a way around it in some areas.
Thanks, Nicki. Denise, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just all of those issues are issues we grapple with at Women's Pioneer and through the Women's Housing Forum. So picking the issue around PTSD first, there's some research by the American military which shows that the experience of domestic abuse and sexual violence is equivalent to being in a war zone. In fact, women are more likely to experience PTSD as a result of those experiences than war veterans are. And I think for many women, what they want is permanent safe accommodation rather than keep moving to different places. And some women will need support in that permanent accommodation, but it doesn't have to be that you have to get, it shouldn't be that you have to go through a refuge first to do it. And that can operate as a disincentive for women who don't feel safe in a shared house and things like that. So we know that that's massive. And so a quarter of our properties are allocated to some of the local referral agencies like Solace Women's Aid, the Iranian and Kurdish women's rights organisation who deal with women who've experienced honour-based violence, or St Mungo's, who recognise that domestic abuse is one of the leading causes of homelessness for women. But lots of housing associations are under pressure from local authorities to give local authorities 100% of the nominations. And then you get into this issue around local connection. So we're able to do that because we haven't been as dependent on grant as some other associations, but that limits the amount of accommodation we can develop and provide. But it's a really big issue that local authorities need to think joined up in terms of housing policy. Things like the Pan-London reciprocal help, and to develop that in other regions would really be good. I think what Nicki's just said around Section 106 is absolutely critical and really important to balancing that. So I think those issues are all linked up in doing it. And similarly, under the Domestic Abuse Bill, single women who've experienced domestic abuse will be considered to be in priority need. So whether local authorities have got the funding or not, they're going to have to pick up this issue. So actually, there's an opportunity here to argue for more funding, but there's also an opportunity to think about how can we resolve those issues. and bringing in the other things like the nomination agreements and the Section 106, and seeing whether through that we can agree partnerships which will enable women who are entitled to housing through that to be offered suitable accommodation. For most women, they are not saying that they specifically need women-centred housing, but for some women, and we find it through our referral agencies, we ask those to prioritise women who specifically want women-centred housing. That's got that kind of sensitivity around gender and understand the issues around PTSD in particular, and can offer support going on. But that's permanent, long-term move-on accommodation. And yet too often domestic abuse is just seen as an emergency response, I think. Sorry, that's a bit of a
Denise, thank you. I think that's really strong to hear that. So we've now got Safia Jama just joined us. It's really lovely to see you, Safia. I know you've had a really busy morning. We've just been hearing from Nicki and Denise, who work in the women's housing sector, and I've introduced you already about Women's Inclusive Team and what you do as a grassroots organisation. We'd really be grateful to hear from you for 5 minutes or so about the experiences of the organisation and what you think needs to change. So over to you, Safia.
Gosh, firstly, like to echo what I said in the chat group, which I'm so sorry that I'm late. Councillor Rachel Blake, I really appreciate you inviting me, and lovely to be in a room of amazing women, and I guess discussing such an important topic that has to be done from a political, from I guess different leaders and all the different hats that we have working together. So I guess Women's Inclusive Team is a registered charity based in Tower Hamlet, supporting women in all different areas, and we very much support women from a holistic approach. And we know that when we're talking about a woman, and specifically around domestic violence, that it's not just the legal side or just the housing, that there needs to be a more of a holistic approach that needs to be supported, a wraparound service. So for our organisation, we provide from learning, which is creative English, mentor sessions, coffee morning. We also have a food bank, a community kitchen, because often when these women have to move from one location to another, they need basic support. We have advice and guidance, and we also have a tuition and mentoring for young kids. And actually, if a woman, in terms of her mental well-being, as we have services around mental well-being, we also know that what's happening with her children is also really important to give her that support in terms of her and her family. I guess when you look at domestic violence, and we had an amazing conference last week around domestic violence, and we had from Solace to Safer Lives attending, both CEO of those organizations attending, and that was such a meaningful discussion, because often what we don't realize is actually when we look at domestic violence, we just think it's just one issue, and we understand it, but actually we need to understand that some of the Black Somali community in domestic violence hasn't been fully explored. What are the nuances that go with that? What stops them from accessing support? And we went into the tribal element, as we know that the Somali community is very much built on tribal layers of tribal involvement. And actually when two people marry or come together, that it's the tribes that come together. And actually if they're two different tribes, one needs to understand the pressure that woman has in that community, in that scenario, that she might be engaging with amazing stakeholders and services, but unless they understand the wider picture, it is extremely hard and challenging for her. So I guess as an organisation, we've identified, and we've done a mini research where we've asked, I think it was 108 women about, I guess, domestic violence and what their thoughts were. And majority of those women were from the Black Somali community. And what became really apparent is for them actually going to the tribe or the family was the way forward to inform the police or stakeholders what's happening, brings name and shame on her and her family and her community. So that's really important. And two of the case studies that we looked at also were both based actually in Bristol, but from Somali community, because we know the Somali culture doesn't have barriers or borders as boroughs. But both case studies spoke very detailedly, and there were both fatal deaths at the end of that, where actually one of them still resonates with me until this day, and this was in COVID, that the neighbours that were Somali, actually was a block that had high numbers of Somali residents, heard of, I guess, the woman asking for help and saying, please put the knife down in Somali, this discussion has been taken place, and I guess the neighbours are hearing this. For them, when they heard that, they did not, as an action from a Somali perspective, it wasn't to call 999, it was to call the tribal leader who lived up the road. And so this report and this case study that I'll share with Rachel, maybe she could share that with you, when they went off to go and call the tribal leader, by the time that he came back, came to the house, the individual was, the woman was killed by the perpetrator. And I think for me, that resonates so much, because actually the Somali community will do everything and anything before going to the police. In fact, that's their last option. And by going there and leaves the police, no longer is the story about what he was doing to her or the situation that she found herself in, but rather the fact that she called external people, authority, in against her husband. And so the pressures of that is so challenging for a woman to face. And I think stakeholders need to understand that. Now, what upsets me, I guess, from a community activist perspective, is the fact that we don't have Somali-speaking professionals around domestic violence. And that ultimately means that services that provide amazing work across London, across UK, don't have the expertise, don't know the elephant in the room when you're having a discussion with a Somali woman. You don't know all the nuances that you need to be aware of. So how can you then provide the support that that Somali woman needs and her family? And I think that's really a challenge. I think the other thing that came out on the questionnaire was the lack of understanding of what domestic abuse is. For them, they did not understand that ultimately physical violence was something that they all agreed was, but actually, you know, financial control or the other emotional abuses, they did not see that. And I think that really came out quite clear and loud on the survey. I think more work needs to be done. For us, definitely, we're saying that research needs to be taking place specifically around, I guess, that community, and making sure that we ensure that there's awareness, not only with the community for them to understand what domestic abuse is, but also for domestic violence services or any stakeholder to ensure actually when you're interacting or engaging with those communities that we have better understanding and investment ultimately in terms of funds, and having those people that are from the Somali community also equally domestic violence specialists, and having those two people is really fundamental if we want to make a difference. Now, one statistics I want to leave you with is that in Tower Hamlets specifically, and by the way, it's not just in Tower Hamlets, but I guess in Tower Hamlets, Solace, who do an amazing job, said that in the period that they've been running their domestic violence, and this is obviously emergency, they've only had one Somali person accessing that service. Not to say that Somali community, only one person was experiencing domestic violence, because we know that it all affects us equally, but it shows you and highlights for me the fact that we've spoken about so many barriers, and that for me is evidence to say there's barriers that we need to break. There's a blockage there that needs to be unblocked. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Safia, so much. That was really powerful. I'm so grateful that you made the time for us and just supporting that urgent call for investment in culturally competent services, where particularly the points that you made about language and understanding the community response as well, and the impact of that on women. So we've got about 10 more minutes, and I know that Lisa wanted to come in, and Sheila and I would really like to draw your attention to our motion as well, which Sheila has put in the chat, and Sheila can update us on where we're going, or Sheila and I can share ideas about where we're going with our motion from Labour Housing Group on this issue. So I'm sure there'll be more questions as well for Safia, so please do wave or put your hands up. Lisa.
Hi everyone, I'm from Southampton Test. I'm a childminder, and a few years back I'd done some work for the local authority, and I used to look after children whose mums were in the women-only refuge, because the impact on the children, a lot of people don't even think about it, but the impact on the children can affect them for the rest of their lives, and it affects their behaviour towards other children, especially ones that have seen the violence. They think they can go and hit other children. So a lot of work needs to be done there as well to support the woman and the children in the future, and going forward. It's not a quick fix, but you know, there's some great work going on, and I'm really glad that I managed to get into here today to hear all this. So brilliant.
Thank you, Lisa. I think that issue about supporting children and that whole family approach is absolutely vital, and it's something that I'll be taking away about how we can make that more part of policies locally, but also campaign for that to be part of national government policy. And Sheila, do you want to talk a bit about our motion or where it's got to?
You're on mute.
Sorry. We sent in a motion for this conference, which I've rather clumsily put into the chat. Sadly, in the priorities ballot, it was placed in the women and housing section, which didn't get onto the ballot, onto the list that's going to be discussed. I asked for it to be put in the domestic violence section, which is going to be discussed, but it hasn't been. So I wonder if anybody was willing to move it at their constituency. I think it's a really important set of issues. So we wanted to highlight, it came out of Nicki and Denise's presentation at our earlier meetings, and it particularly focuses on this issue of on the issues that we've been talking about. So the need to make sure that people can be housed and seen as a priority when they've moved areas, and getting providers to look at making reciprocal arrangements and providing women-only public spaces. So I wonder if anybody would like to move it at their branch and constituency. If you want to email me, I'll send you the resolution properly. I don't have a way of collecting all your email addresses from your presence here, I'm afraid. So you'll need to put it in the chat. But I'll put in our email address.
Thanks, Sheila. I think that's a really good idea, and it's something that Labour Housing Group is trying to do more of, to share with our members, with members of Labour Housing Group, ideas for motions that they can take to their branches, their ward Labour parties, their constituency Labour parties, to really raise awareness of this issue. So yeah, that's fantastic. If people are sharing their contact details in the chat, and then you can get hold of Sheila and I on that email address. And so the motion would be really positive if you could push it through your branches. We'll also be sharing information about campaigns that will be running in advance of the National Labour Party conference, which will be in September. And is there anybody who'd like to ask questions of Safia? Because I had some observations as well, unless anybody else wants to come in. Okay, so there's two issues that I think that we could really push at the moment. The first is about culturally competent services, and really making sure that that's something that is part of policy making consciousness, not just in big cities, but across the country as well. And I think that's because we know that this is an issue for women across the country, and so I think that that's something that we should really be pushing and talk to our members about, and talk to Labour Housing Group members, but also work with other organisations throughout the Labour Party to really raise awareness about that, so that party members are conscious of the impact that this has. Because at the end of the day, this is a rights issue. This is about women's rights, a women's right to safety, and a women's right to housing as well. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about, this Section 106 agreement issue, I thought was really interesting what Nicki said about that. There would have been no intention to block women in an unsafe situation when writing that agreement. But my experience, having worked in planning and housing for many years, is that they can be quite difficult. It's not impossible to change, but they can be quite difficult to change, and it does require a variation. So it's something that I think we need to, again, that issue of if this is too narrow, we need to be making sure that there's part of that Section 106 agreement that says unless there's an emergency or a safety situation. And then finally, just about local authorities and people approaching local authorities. Denise talked a bit about the London-wide reciprocal, and I might bring you in, Denise, to talk a bit more about the London-wide reciprocal, because many years ago. I used to work on that about 10 or 12 years ago, and it means that women don't have to approach a neighbouring authority as homeless, because if you approach an authority saying that you're homeless, you lose a tenancy, and that is obviously a huge barrier for people who may have children and settled networks in that sense. And I think we should do some policy work and some campaigning work about understanding that as a barrier, because I think it's still too prevalent in housing options or homelessness services that the response is to quote unquote go homeless, which is just not the right thing. So Denise, could you just in the last few minutes, has that prompted anybody else to ask questions? No, I really want to give space to people to come in. So if you haven't spoken or you feel you'd like to say something, then please do put your hand up. But Denise, can you explain a bit about the reciprocal and where you think we can go with it?
I think you've set out how it works in London really well. The issue I'm making is kind of a wider one about taking that across other regions, but also not just about people who approach local authorities, but also giving housing associations. So we've got a pan-London reciprocal between other housing providers, and we often contact people and say, okay, we've got this woman who's experienced domestic abuse and she needs to move somewhere else, and if we'll happily take a nomination back. I think the big issue for local authorities is this push to have housing providers giving 100% nominations to them for people in their local authority, because we have to fight quite hard to keep, in fact, 50% of our properties we allocate ourselves. So 25% through the agencies and 25% through, it's not really a waiting list. Once a year, we open our waiting list for 2 weeks and we prioritise the women who apply, and we say to them, if you haven't got a house by the end of the year, a flat by the end of the year, then you'll need to reapply next year, because we're so tiny. We've got 40 members of staff. We can't do a waiting list. But when I talk to some of the bigger associations, all their new developments, it's been built in, there's a section 106, and that will include a nomination agreement which says 100% of these properties will be given to people who live in Hammersmith or who live in Westminster or who live in, Bromley or wherever it is. And then that's where the problem comes in. So it's about understanding nomination agreements, grant funding, and section 106, and for local authorities to think, well, how can we leave some space in that system to enable housing providers to support women who are fleeing domestic abuse and who don't want to be housed in the same borough that they've experienced the abuse.
I think that's a really, really strong point, Denise. And as a local councillor and somebody that is always really keen to make sure, just speaking to the kind of local homes issue, I've always been really pushing for 100% nominations. But I think that there is, and in the area with some of the worst overcrowding and homelessness in London, but I think that point about an emergency situation and how we can work with housing associations is a really strong one. And I think that we can take that away into our own communities, into our branches, into our constituency parties, and really just raise awareness and find out more about how it's working. So if you're if you're in an area that has where Labour runs your council, you can ask them questions about how they respond to this, what their arrangements are in place with housing providers. That's a really good start. If you're in an area where Labour doesn't run the council, you can ask any Labour representatives that you do have nearby to find out for you. And then we in Labour Housing Group are very keen to hear about this, and then to raise more awareness about how we can change it, because we have quite a broad membership in Labour Housing Group. We've got local groups in Manchester, the North East, now the South West as well, and so we can bring people together to call for some of these changes that we think might help. We're coming up to the end of our session, so if anybody would like to make some closing reflections or remarks. Okay, so I'm really conscious, as we all will be in events like this, that one in 4 women experiences domestic abuse. So talking about these issues and being part of this kind of discussion can be really distressing for for anybody attending. So I'm grateful for your time and your commitment to this issue, and it's just been really positive to see how many people are here sharing information and sharing their knowledge. So please do keep in touch, and we look at our motion and see if you can propose that in a branch, then let us know, and we're always happy to help with speakers come to branches as well, and constituency meetings. And I might even nominate Safia, Denise and Nicki to do the same if they've got time as well, with modern technology enabling us to Zoom across the country at any moment.
Yeah,
so
happy to do that.
Great. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. And please do consider joining Labour Housing Group. We're soon to set up a Labour Housing Group Women's Network.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.